Good afternoon. My name is Paul Mehta, and I'm with the National ALS Registry. I want to thank the ALS Association of the Western Pennsylvania chapter for the opportunity to speak at your research symposium. Today we'll be talking about how the National ALS Registry can support your research initiatives. No disclosures. The outline of the presentation today will be what we do here at the National ALS Registry. We do a lot more than just count ALS cases, as well as the federal ALS research initiatives, just to kind of clarify what everybody does in the federal landscape of ALS funding, as well as our registry surveys, the National ALS Biorepository, our clinical notification mechanism, how we connect ALS patients with clinical trials and studies, publications, and the research we fund, and any questions at the end. So we do a lot more than just count ALS cases at the National ALS Registry. We have the National ALS Biorepository, which I'll be going over. We do the epidemiology of ALS, such as looking at incidence, prevalence, mortality in the U.S. We work with partner organizations such as the ALS Association, which is our largest partner. We also have survey data, which are completed by patients when they come to the online portal at our website at cdc.gov/ALS. We also have our research notification mechanism, like I just mentioned. This is where we connect ALS patients with clinical trials and epidemiological studies. We also fund research. So just very quickly, just want to touch upon all the federal ALS research initiatives that are going on. This is kind of like an alphabet soup right here, and I just want to make sure that people realize what we do and how it's different from what others do. So the NIH in general does a lot of the basic science and biomedical research. That's what they typically fund. They're looking at areas at the cell level, how to halt cell death, slow disease progression, looking at gene mutations, cellular defects, the development of biomarkers, and so forth. CDRMP, which stands for the Congressional Directed Medical Research Program, which is with the Department of Defense. They look at preclinical development of therapeutic agents, so potentially drugs that could be approved by the FDA. And a lot of these funding involves looking at the stability, toxicology, pharmacokinetics of these particular drugs that they want to go ahead and test at the preclinical level. What we do here at CDC-ATSDR at the National ALS Registry, we're trying to find out what causes ALS, which is really important. The etiology, that is what causes ALS. The risk factors for ALS. So are these risk factors and possible etiologies environmental exposures? Are they heavy metals? Are they something called persistent organic pollutants, such as pesticides and so forth? So we're here trying to answer the unknowns of ALS, as well as the public health impact of ALS, at the national level. So certainly it's very important to kind of discern what we do from what others do as well. But the bottom line is, at CDC, we are here looking to figuring out exactly what causes ALS and identifying the risk factors for ALS. These are our risk factor surveys. We currently have 17 risk factor surveys, soon to be 18. These surveys right here are asking patients when they first come into the registry about demographics, occupational history, where do they work, were they in the military, did they smoke, their physical activity, also their family history of neurodiseases. So for example, did they have Parkinson's, Alzheimer's in the family? As well as we also have an ALS-FRS disease progression survey, where patients take it when they first join, as well as an email reminder sent to them to go ahead and take these surveys every 6 months. We also have something where we collect clinical data, phenotypic information on ALS patients. So for example, are they on, do they have a peg, do they use a wheelchair, as well as their initial onset of ALS. We also have something called open-ended etiological questions, where patients themselves tell us what they think may have caused their disease. As you can see, this is certainly a very, very rich data set of information on ALS patients. We also just got approved for Survey 18, which is going to be primarily focused on sports and looking at TBIs within these particular sports. As of earlier this month, or as of last month, we had over 90,000 completed surveys, and these are certainly going up, and it's also, like I said, one of the largest collection of ALS survey data in the country, if not the world. The National ALS Biorepository is very unique. The Biorepository was formed after a pilot study that was done, which deemed it to be feasible to go ahead and create a National ALS Biorepository. What we do is we link all that survey data that I just showed you to the biosamples. And all these samples, these are also nationally representative, meaning to say they are beyond the referral centers. They're not coming from one specific geographical location. They're coming from around the country. So we go around the country, coast to coast, to go ahead and collect these samples. Also, it's user friendly. We come to the patient's homes to go ahead and collect these samples. And these samples, are pristine samples. They're not, for example, like from leftover studies or a study that was concluded. So these are pristine samples which have never been used before, which are available for researchers. And these samples could certainly be used in the areas of genetics, biomarkers, disease progression, and so forth. And most importantly, this is a free service for patients. We come to their home, we'll go in and collect their blood as well as their saliva. There's also a postmortem component as well, which I'll briefly mention in the next slide. The postmortem component is where we collect, for example, here's the schematic right here. But so the postmortem component, we collect bone, brain, spinal cord, CSF, and muscle. With the in-home collections, we collect blood, urine, as well as saliva. And these are kind of entered into the biorepository, and all those risk factor surveys I showed you, 17 of them, are actually matched with the patients. And as researchers request these samples, we make sure all these data, are matched, and they actually are sent out with the specimens themselves. This right here is a current inventory of actual samples right now. We had to, it's not been updated only because we had a lull and a temporary suspension due to COVID-19. But this is pretty accurate. We're actually currently almost at 50 collected postmortem samples. And then we have over 1,300 patients who actually, are currently in the biorepository. So from that, we have DNA, RNA, plasma, PBMCs, and so forth, hair, nails, as well as fibroblasts, muscle, like I mentioned before, in the biorepository postmortem component. So this certainly is a very, very rich data set of samples which are available for researchers to go ahead and request. And there is no charge to go ahead and request samples. The only fee we charge researchers is a very nominal shipping fee. And these are some of the institutions which are currently using our tissues and our samples. So, for example, Columbia is using brain tissue for looking at something called extracellular vesicles and how they can be used as potentially as biomarkers. We are internally doing analyses on whole blood, serum, and urine, looking for heavy metals, and as well as other areas. Dartmouth was looking at fingernails and potentially how they can relate to exposures and so forth. That's the University of Pittsburgh, which is also another funded institution, which I'll be mentioning in my upcoming slides, which is in your backyard. These guys are looking at risk factors to persistent organic pollutants and so forth. As you can see, these are certainly a rich data set. A rich, as in terms of samples going out to these particular institutions. The NIH, they are doing our genotyping for us, as well as our whole genome sequencing on our biorepository samples. So just want to move on to the research notification system. This is where we connect ALS patients to clinical trials and epi studies. And as we all know, clinical trials certainly are very, very important to hopefully have treatment options for ALS patients. And as we're all aware, there are currently only 2 FDA-approved drugs for ALS, Radicava as well as Riluzole. Currently, the folks who there are over 50 institutions who've actually used used our system for clinical trials and epi studies, and it's available for both domestic and international researchers. So it's a pretty user-friendly system. There's no CDC IRB approval required. The only approval that we need is the IRB approval of the applicant's institution. If it is for example, a multi-site clinical trial, we don't need 20 IRB approvals. Just one single IRB approval is fine. We like to say if it's good enough for the FDA, it's good enough for CDC. So certainly we want to go ahead and make sure this is user-friendly system for pharmaceutical companies to go ahead and have a way to recruit patients for their clinical trials. We can stratify patients by age, sex, time since diagnosis, as well as send these notifications regionally as well. So, for example, they can be sent to just the West Coast, the East Coast, and everywhere in between. And the approval time typically is less than 4 weeks. So once we get the application and if it's complete, we can go ahead and get it approved within 4 weeks. So these are some of the highlighted notifications that have used the registry. Brainstorm is one of them, which certainly is in the news for their neurone study, their stem cell clinical trial. Orphazyme, Michael Benatar is using that for their particular study. Orion Pharmaceuticals for ODM 109, looking to improve the respiratory function in ALS patients. Amylyx Pharmaceuticals, AMX 0035, looking to hopefully slow down disease progression and improve muscle strength, as well as we've done clinical trials for Cytokinetics, Neuraltis, and Flex Pharma. The list is pretty long, so I can't really go into it, but there's over a dozen pharma companies who've actually used our system. We also use this system for risk factors, like I mentioned, epidemiological studies, risk factor studies. And so we've actually helped the ALS Association in their ALS Focus Survey, which is looking at evaluating patient and caregiver burden. Dr. Hiroshi Matsumoto at Columbia University, we actually helped him to recruit for his study looking at oxidative stress and how that plays into ALS. And we recently did a study for Chad Hewall over at the University of Rochester Medical Center, where they're measuring the quality of life in ALS patients. We also had one recently, which we did for the University of Cincinnati, and this one was for COVID-19. They're looking to look at how the impact of COVID-19 is playing on ALS patients. They're looking at areas such as comorbidities, impact on families, as well as any interactions with treatments. And University of Cincinnati is part of the NIH's Research Disease Clinical Research Consortium, or the RDCRN. These are the upcoming clinical trials using the registry. So we have the Healy ALS platform trial, which has also been in the news. The platform trial, this is the first ever ALS platform trial, and they're looking to test multiple treatments at once to reduce the cost of research by over 30%, decrease the time to trial by 50%, as well as increasing participation by over 60, or by almost close to 70%, 67%. So they're looking to test 5 experimental treatments in this platform trial. And this is certainly really, really exciting because, I mean, having a platform trial and to be able to test multiple drugs at once is certainly very, very important. We're also going to be doing a clinical trial for the NIH for Dr. Ravindra Nath at the NIH for HERV-K. And this actually, what he's doing is, HERV-K is an endogenous virus. And so they're treating ALS patients with antiretrovirals. And so these are the same drugs they treat HIV patients with to see if potentially it could suppress or even slow progression. And some other upcoming clinical trials and studies we'll be doing is the Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma for their oral formulation of edaravone or Radicava, as well as a biomarker study, the Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center study for L-serine, as well as another study looking at COVID-19 and how riluzole or edaravone potentially could help, suppress the cytokine storm, which is found in which can happen in COVID-19 patients. So they're looking to see if these 2 particular drugs, which are being used for ALS, could potentially be a therapeutic agent for COVID-19. So just very quickly, just to kind of wrap up with the notification system and the impact of it, this is, like I said, has been used by over a dozen drug companies for their clinical trials. And the approval is, within a month. It's a pretty quick approval. It's a free service for companies as well as academia. We estimate over 3,000 ALS patients just by looking at 50 studies, on average recruiting 50 patients, which is 2,500 patients but we know many studies actually recruit a lot more than 50 patients. And this is the largest population of ALS patients in the U.S. Are sitting on the National ALS Registry for research purposes. So the publications we have underway, we actually do quite a bit of publications, publishing in peer-reviewed journals, and so we want to make sure we get our results out, our findings out to the public. We currently have over 75 peer-reviewed publications, and these are presented at various meetings, AAN, NEALS, and so forth. Two notable publications we have in 2020 were with the University of Michigan, where they actually looked at early metal dysregulation in ALS and how that impacted during early childhood. And so they actually measured metal levels, manganese, nickel, tin, so forth, in teeth. And what they actually found was it revealed direct evidence that ultra metal uptake in early life is potentially associated with adult onset ALS. So that certainly is very interesting. We also were a co-author on a paper with Dr. Angeline Andrews at Dartmouth University, and where they took nail clippings of female ALS patients and compared it to controls, and they found that mercury levels were almost over 2.3 folds higher in ALS patients when compared to controls. This potentially suggests that excessive mercury exposure could be associated with certainly bad outcomes in this aging population. So we fund research, and so people don't realize that the National ALS Registry funds research. We have research monies to go ahead and do that, and we currently have funded 17 research studies, and we know there's a hunger to go ahead and fund research. And in the earlier slide, I showed you about what we do, what the NIH does, and what DOD does. This is where we do the bulk of our research dollars go out to academic institutions. And like I said, we're looking for etiology and risk factors for ALS. We also are working with the NIH for whole genome sequencing for our biorepository samples. And these analyses are currently underway. So these are our currently funded grants with the National ALS Registry. Northwestern was funded last year, and they're looking at genetic variants of innate immunity with APOL1 in DNA and RNA and how it contributes to ALS. Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center is looking at what the time periods when exposures in the environment, such as cyanobacteria, pesticides, and as well as looking at various polluted sites and how they potentially create a risk for developing ALS. The University of Michigan is looking at something called metabolomics, and looking at to see how this potentially correlates with exposure such as POPs or persisting organic pollutants, and identifying risk factors for ALS, as well as evaluating ALS disease progression. Moving on, Columbia University, Dr. Neil Schneider is looking at something called extracellular vesicles, and this is part of our samples that we gave to Columbia in the Biorepository, and they're looking to evaluate toxic exposures in brains by looking at these EVs which are shed, and these EVs potentially could also be biomarkers. Dr. Evelyn Talbot is looking at environmental toxicants and ambient air pollution by looking at serum and plasma levels. Serum and plasma, which she got from the National ALS Biorepository, and it's also a case control study. And some of these toxicants include, like I mentioned before, insecticides, pesticides, and so forth. Trinity College, Dr. Orla Hardiman, she's actually looking at and trying to understand why the Hispanic population in South America has a lower rate of ALS when compared to Europeans. And this is at Trinity College, Dublin. And these were our past funded institutions. Stanford University was looking at antecedent medical conditions such as the role of hyperlipidemia, diabetes, and autoimmune diseases, as well as the drugs and how they kind of factor into ALS. Areas such as it's more susceptible to go ahead and getting ALS and so forth, and how that kind of figures in regarding the use of these drugs and how they are linked with hyperlipidemia and all these comorbid conditions. Dr. Michael Benatar is looking at the gene and environment interaction and how they impact ALS, and this is a partnership with the RDCRN, which was University of Cincinnati. I mentioned was what was the group that used our notification system a few slides ago for their study, and this is part of that same consortium. So Dr. Michael Bennett, like I mentioned, is looking at the gene-environment interaction and how they impact ALS. And we also funded Harvard in the past, and Harvard University was looking at risk factors and biomarkers of ALS and whether plasma levels at U-rate could predict ALS risk. Dr. Mark Weisskopf was looking at how, for example, lead, military service, and smoking can be potential risk factors for ALS. So in 2021, our fiscal year in 2021, which begins on October 1st, we want to go ahead and fund additional grants. Between now and September 30th, we're hoping to fund 2 additional grants. So we'd have a total of 19 research grants that we've actually would have funded. And so that's certainly something exciting. We're looking to go ahead and, like I said, add to our portfolio of what we funded. But in 2021, we're looking to go ahead and fund additional research. So if you're interested in applying, please apply through grants.gov. This is an R01. We're looking to fund 1 to 4, probably closer to 500,000. Those slides says 400,000, but probably closer to 500,000 ceiling. And the areas we're looking at are military service, TBIs, physical sports, as well as environmental and occupational risk factors. So just in conclusion, the National ALS Registry is the only population-based ALS registry in the U.S. We are fulfilling our congressional mandate from Congress, looking at the who, what, when, and where of ALS epidemiology, case counts, incidence, prevalence, mortalities, and the demographics of disease. And the why, we're collecting, analyzing in thousands of risk factor surveys, like I showed you guys before, to help determine etiology. We're also working with, we also have the National ALS Biorepository, where we can go ahead and expand ALS research. We're helping drug companies recruit for their clinical trials and epidemiological studies. We also provide data for biospecimens as well as to researchers. And we're also funding external research. And we also partner with ALS groups such as the ALS Association, like I mentioned, which is one of our most important group partner out there. So it's certainly important that what we do to figure out what causes ALS and identify the risk factors for ALS. Thank you, and I'll take your questions.